Hello and welcome to another edition of Gray Matter. I'm really thrilled today to have on a guest who I consider one of the modern fathers of Confederation. When I was a junior high school student in Edmonton around 1981, 1982, the gentleman we have on the show today was busy meeting with all the other premiers and the Prime Minister of Canada, working out the details of repatriating our Constitution and also creating a new document that became enshrined in our Constitution, which we all know today as the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. More than just being the last living signatory to that document, he's one of the crafters of parts of the Charter. And so we're going to get a chance to talk to him about those experiences and also his unique understanding of the purpose of the Charter, the intention behind the Charter. So we have today Mr. Brian Peckford, member of the Privy Council, former Premier of Newfoundland from 1979 to 1989. As I said, was one of the chief architects of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which turns 40 on the 17th of April, 2022, and that is the title of today's podcast, 40. So as I said, Mr. Peckford is the last living signatory to the Charter, and in recent months has been openly critical of how governments and courts have both misconstrued and misapplied Section 1 in particular of the Charter. Mr. Peckford recently launched his own Charter challenge against restriction of Section 6 mobility rights and gave a stirring speech to peaceful protesters in the freezing cold at the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa last month. On this subject of Section 6, we're going to come to that, but just by way of introduction, I don't know if many people realize that today, unless you're vaccinated against COVID-19, you cannot get on a plane, a train, or a boat. I'm sounding a bit like Dr. Seuss all of a sudden. But you cannot travel not only internationally, but you cannot travel anywhere in the country. And this is the only nation that I know of. Mr. Peckford could perhaps correct this, but I can't think of any other nation where that's true, where we simply cannot travel through modern means, modern vehicles, as we understand them, in Canada. And so we're going to talk about why that is and what's going on in Canada. We're going to get into his Charter challenge, but also some of the history. And so it's a very exciting opportunity to speak to someone. I don't want to embarrass him, but he's sort of a living artifact of Canadian history. And so I'm very excited to have him here and get a chance to speak with him. And I promise we're going to let him do most of the talking. I'm sure it's going to be a very, very fascinating conversation. So before I get into that, I want to frame our discussion. Part of what we do on Gray Matter is we have a quotation or a series of them, aphorisms that kind of frame the discussion. And so I've entitled this episode 40 because the Charter is turning 40. And so I brought to mind something that's a biblical reference, actually. Famous Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and he heard my cry. And that sort of springs to mind a little bit of what's happening in Canada right now, where a lot of people are hoping and praying and waiting patiently for something good to happen. But it's also a call to action because hearing or issuing a cry is not just a vocal thing. I think it's an actionable imperative. It's something that, and I think this is something that Mr. Peckford this is sort of we're talking about this, sort of stirred him out of his peaceful retirement. He's one of the ones who's issuing a hue and cry about what's going on in Canada, and he's issuing a call to action. And so that's what brought that to mind. There's also if you're an audiophile, the rock band U2 has a version of that song 40, which is on one of their early albums, and it's quite a beautiful rendition. The other thing that it brought to mind, the other quotation I have here is from John Diefenbaker, and I mentioned him, and I expect that Mr. Peckford probably met Mr. Diefenbaker at some point. I wish I had. Mr. Diefenbaker, of course, former Prime Minister of Canada, and during his tenure, he created the Canadian Bill of Rights, which I want to ask Mr. Peckford a little bit about. But I have a quotation here from former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, which I think frames our discussion nicely. He said, "I am a Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong," that's a big one today, "or free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind." The other quotation that I have here, and the last one, is from Alfred Lord Denning, Baron Denning, who was a great, great justice of the British common law. And he famously wrote that the keystone of the rule of law in England, and by implication Canada, has been the independence of judges. This is something we're going to talk about with Mr. Peckford. The independence of judges, and it is only respect. It is the only respect in which we make any real separation of powers. So that's the importance of the judiciary. And we're going to talk about this in terms of interpreting the Charter, applying the Charter, and making it a living document, which really expresses the values, Canadian values, which I know our Prime Minister says don't exist, but I think everyone listening to this podcast can agree that that's not so. Okay, so let's turn to our guest. Now, Brian, good day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really thrilled to speak with you. I've been following your writings and your blog, and I've seen some of your other podcast appearances with Jordan Peterson and so on. And also, you probably realize that we have a mutual friend who's your lawyer, Keith Wilson, brilliant constitutional lawyer, is a classmate of mine from the University of Alberta. And I'm very grateful for him for making this introduction to you so that I can get you on my podcast. What I'd like to do, perhaps, Brian, first of all, if you wouldn't mind, is I know from researching you a little bit, you have very, very fascinating personal history. And so I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, to take us maybe a little bit of a summary of your family background, your teaching career, your entry into politics, and of course, your meteoric rise to the premiership of Newfoundland, and of course, your central role in the drafting of, as I understand it, Section 2, Section 7, Section 15, and Section 1 of the Charter. And perhaps the starting point is, I understand that you were not born Canadian.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece, I guess. And yesterday I was talking to some students, some university students, and I happened to mention that fact, and they were, of course, much younger, and were really surprised that there was somebody alive who was the first minister of this nation, but was not born a Canadian. And I was born in 1942, and Newfoundland joined Confederation in 1949. And so I was almost 7 years old. We joined in March 31st, 1949, and I became 7 that August. So yeah, I was not born a Canadian. Of course, it was through a referendum that Newfoundland joined the Confederation. I don't know if there's any other province who has that distinction, where they actually had a referendum just on joining Canada or not joining Canada. But Newfoundland did in 1949, and we voted very narrowly, by the way, to join Canada. It was 51 to 49, 51% to 49%. So it was very close, and it followed an earlier referendum where we had 3 items on the ballot. It was join Canada, remain independent, or do an economic union with the United States. And interestingly enough, the economic union with the United States was the spokesman for that group who advanced that alternative, had it on the ballot, was John Crosbie's father. And of course, John Crosbie being a well-known Newfoundlander and who had served in the federal cabinet. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so we joined Confederation 1949, and therefore I was not born a Canadian. But as everybody knows now, given my advocacy for the Charter and to defending the Charter in the last 2 years, I'm very much a Canadian. And have a lot at stake here in the sense of my own sense of our country. I said to the students yesterday, by the way, which I think is also an interesting point, one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about that, not only in and of itself because of the written freedoms and rights that are there, as you mentioned, 2, 6, 7, and 15 in particular of the Charter, but also because what a lot of people don't understand, and we can get into it later. I'll do my personal history first, but they don't understand that
you
all of
move
these
however
things.
you want to move, Brian. It's your
Okay.
show.
This was a bargain. Okay, all of these things. You go back to Solon in Greek times and come up through all of the various concoctions of governance procedures for political gain or advantage, or to create a nation. It's a bargain. And there are many things involved in that bargain. But to go back first, and so I wasn't born a Canadian, but became a Canadian in 1949 and went to school. I was born in rural Newfoundland. Both my father and my mother were from St. John's, which in our terms was the very big urban center. It wasn't very big at the time, but it was the urban center of the province. But their ancestry are rural as well. Just about all Newfoundlanders at one time or another, small group were in St. John's, but the majority of people when Newfoundland was founded were in little coves and inlets around the province because of fishing, because we came to Newfoundland for fishing. So my grandfather was born on Fogo Island, which is an island off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, but he left there when he was 16 or 17 years old. And interestingly enough, he jumped ship in St. John's. He was on a sealing ship. And he had been out to the seal fishery as a teenager. And obviously didn't want to stay in an isolated small island off the island of Newfoundland. I wanted to come to a bigger center. And he jumped ship. I think it's rather important. In any case, he went to the seal fishery for 49 straight years and was on 2 sealing disasters where just about everybody died on this in a storm off the coast of Newfoundland. And he survived both of those sealing disasters. And he fished for 50 years out of a cove in the St. John's Harbor and had another fishing premises in another part of Newfoundland, not too far away in Bay Bulls. On my mother's side, my grandfather on my mother's side comes from an island too, off the island of Newfoundland. Can you believe it? So somebody asked me when I came to Vancouver Island, why did you come to Vancouver Island? I said, because I was genetically predisposed to come to Vancouver Island because islands dominate my ancestry. And so my grandfather also on my mother's side came to St. John's. So my mother and father met in St. John's and married. But he became a social worker after Confederation. And so we traveled around rural Newfoundland, and I was born in a small town 50 miles from St. John's called Whitbourne. And then we moved around the province. So I'm sort of like every inch of Newfoundland and rural Newfoundland, or as they would say in St. John's, I'm a Bayman. I'm a Bayman through and through, having been born and raised and went all the schooling I got until university was in rural Newfoundland. So I'm very much a rural person and have sort of retained that fondness for rural parts. And so when I go now and people ask me to speak here on Vancouver Island, I can't travel across the country, and we'll come to that later because of this draconian measure that the federal government brought in. But I can travel up and down Vancouver Island, and I've been doing a lot of speeches, public meetings on the Constitution, explaining the Charter to people. And I go to smaller places, and people are so grateful to think that I came to their small community, and I try to tell them I'm here for a number of reasons, one of which I was born in a small place. And small is just as important to me as large. And they really appreciate that. And not only that, I'm there also because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is about people, and it's about individuals.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about urban people versus rural people or rural people versus urban people or anything like that. It's about people, regardless of where they live, and that they all have certain rights and freedoms as individuals, or as I say very often, every snowflake is unique and every person is unique. And so I come by my rural roots and my small appreciation for small because of my own history. And then I went to Memorial University and graduated there with a degree in education to go teaching. But also I went back to the university and I majored in English literature and economic history.
We have that in common. We've that in common. Yeah. Not Memorial, but I'm an English lit grad.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I did an honors thesis in Shakespeare. So yeah,
wow,
Memorial's sorry to interrupt you, but just a comment. Memorial's a very historic Canadian university, isn't it? There's a lot of great, really well-known scholars. Well, I know your friend Rex Murphy,
yeah,
the Rhodes Scholar is one of them. But yeah, the Memorial's has a very, very precious legacy in Canadian university life. Anyway, sorry to interrupt your train of thought.
And in English literature and history, by the way.
Yes,
both of those. And I was fortunate enough to have some unbelievable professors, both in English literature and in history. And those are the two that I remember most about Memorial, those two. And so I went teaching for a number of years, and we're in, of course, rural Newfoundland. Where else would I go? But that only lasted about 5 years because I sort of got the bug, or I just could not stand by and see what was happening without influencing it or changing it to the way I thought it should be. And so that got me into politics before I was 30. I got elected to the riding where I went teaching. I wasn't born there, but I got elected to that riding, and it was the first time in its history that had ever voted for a Conservative candidate and made them the MLA. Since 1832 to 1972, that area had been Liberal and never Conservative.
That's quite a feat.
So I changed that, and nobody thought I was going to win. The party didn't think I was going to win, and so they never supported me during the election. So I was totally on my own. Funny about that, I'm on my own again. In my 80th year, I'm back alone again, in the sense that all of those who are allegedly connected to me over the years do not support what I'm doing now. They have remained very silent, and that's very unfortunate, very tragic. But it brings me almost full circle, doesn't it? From those early days, 28, 29 years old, being alone and campaigning in a riding that had never been Conservative in its history, and having as my two first people in my little tiny campaign office of one room, two ladies, one was 70 and one was 72. That's who started with me in Springdale, Newfoundland, and where I got elected to the District of Green Bay. So I did get elected. That night, I think I only won by 32 votes. I think it was 32 or 34 votes. But the next day, the student vote came in. And of course, everybody from my riding would have to go to some other place to get post-secondary education. And so they were in Memorial University in a number of college of trades places around the province. So some of them voted. And at the end of the day, I think I won by 150 in my first stab at provincial politics, which was great. I mean, so there was no question then that I had won the riding. There was no recount or anything like that, 150 being sort of out of the range for there being any chance of it being overturned. And so I went to St. John's as the first Conservative MLA for that riding. And I knew before I even arrived there, and I guess this is true of a lot of other Newfoundlanders too, could say the same thing, because of my oral history in our schools at the time, we were used to speaking, and we actually had to stand up in our place before our desk and answer a question that the teacher asked. So you couldn't answer the question sitting down. You had to stand up and address the class.
That's just brilliant.
That was in a convent school in Marystown, Newfoundland in 1951-52. And amazing. It wasn't in the school I had come from grade 1, 2, and 3. because that was a Protestant school, because we had religious schools in Newfoundland at the time. But in the convent school, we were the only Protestants in that community, by the way. When my father moved there as a social worker, we were the only ones, the only students in the convent school that were Protestant. And it was a great revelation to a lot of the Catholic kids that there were these strange characters that didn't frequent their church. Although we did go to all of the major events in the Catholic Church through the school. Mm-hmm. My father went and saw the Lady Superior, Mother Superior, and said to her, "I'm going to have a number of children coming to your school." There was 4 of us, I think, who were going to their school. 4 boys. So he said to them, "Now I want you to understand. You understand that I'm the new social worker here, and we're not of your Christian denomination. We're of a different Christian denomination. But I want you to treat them as if they were Catholics. I want everything to be exactly the same. I want no exceptions made for them in any way, shape, or form. If you're going to the church on a certain day because it's a religious day in your denomination, they go too."
That was wise of them.
They stay for the prayers. They don't you dare put them outside for the prayers. Now, my dad was a very good guy.
Yeah.
And like you say, and I'm glad you mentioned that. That was very smart of him.
Yeah.
And so we learned things that we would not have learned. And so it was through that school that I learned a lot. And then we moved on to other places and went to other schools. And then, like I say, but in any case, I went to St. John's and was immediately because of that training in oral tradition, attracted immediately to the legislature. I loved the legislature. I really loved it. And I think one of the problems we have today with a lot of leaders is that they don't love the legislature. The quicker they can get out of the legislature, the better. Whereas in my experience, I loved the debate. I loved the cut and thrust of the debate. I loved the new bill that we, as a government, had argued about in caucus and argued about in cabinet and brought to the legislature. And we already had debated it a lot, and then had the people from the other side or the other parties debate it, and then have your vote. That to me is the essence of democracy. And I hope I don't forget this trend when we later talk about the charter, because I want to address something in the charter about that very, very directly. But now that I have time to talk this way, most people, we've got a short period of time. So and I don't know if I mentioned this in the scores and scores of Zoom calls or these kinds of virtual calls that I've done. I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but I loved the legislature. And so therefore I grabbed to the legislature immediately. The premier of the day recognized this, and within a few months I was his parliamentary assistant, and within a few months I was his executive assistant or special assistant in his office. And so
like a meteor.
I wasn't a lonely MLA very long. Very soon involved in all of the decision making, that I could be. And then, of course, within 2 years, I was a minister on the cabinet, and then I ran for office for the leadership in 1979. And once again, I wasn't supposed to win. I think there were 8 candidates, and I was supposed to come like third. Like a lot of the media and a lot of the pundits at the time thought I would do. As the leadership went on, they could see that I wasn't going to come 8th or 7th or 6th. I had a good campaign, and it looked like I was making headway, and for sure I could likely come third, and therefore perhaps be one of the kingmakers, whoever was going to be premier. Well, it didn't happen that way. I won, and on the third ballot, by the way, it wasn't the first ballot. It was the third ballot, but I was number 1 on the first ballot. I had the most votes, and then I accumulated enough on the second to almost make it, and then on the third, I made it. And so I became the premier of Newfoundland automatically because, I became leader of the dominant party in the legislature, and so automatically premier at the age of 36. that is the youngest First Minister in Newfoundland's history, except one. And that was in the 1832. The first Prime Minister of Newfoundland was a guy by the name of Philip Little, and he was 34. But outside of him, I am the youngest First Minister in Newfoundland's history. And I was then, and I think I am still to this day.
Mm-hmm.
So that was quite a move, and but I enjoyed every minute of it. And becoming First Minister was not, to me, something that was up there. It was something that was here that I could battle and that I could handle. And so once again, I grasped that role in the same way as I did becoming MLA and enjoyed it. And I wanted to be in the House as Premier. I wanted to be there introducing bills. I wanted to be there to be a part of the debates. Even though another minister might introduce the legislation or whatever, I still wanted to be part of the debate, and was a lot of the time. And so that then thrust me into I got elected in 1979 in March, and within 2 years, right, 80, 81, even in 1980, the whole question of patriation of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms became foremost in talks between the First Ministers and all the First Ministers. So it wasn't very long before I was thrust right into the constitutional environment, which I'm back in now, these many years later. Well, say I was 30, 31, I'm now going on 80, so there you go. That's almost 50 years ago. And so, therefore, that brought me right in touch with the kinds of issues that I'm now talking about again today in 2022. So that gives you a little tiny bit of a quick history of me, partly as a person. By the way, I also enjoyed teaching a lot. And the 5 years I had teaching, I thoroughly enjoyed. And still I hear from some of my former students, one who writes on my blog all the time, I didn't even know, but I recognized this name that came up on my blog about 2 years ago. And I said to my wife one day, I taught a person by that name. And she said, yeah, you did. And I said, I got a sneaky suspicion, because he was good at writing. He was good at English, and I got a sneaky suspicion that's my former student. Well, one day in a debate on my blog with somebody else who was attacking me personally, my former student wrote in again to say, you can debate his policies, you can debate his views, but when you start to attack my former teacher and my person and my idol, then you're in trouble. And so then I knew that was my former. But I enjoyed teaching. One other little point that people should know is that I began as a liberal. Hard to figure that out now, anybody who knows my views. But I began as a liberal in that riding where I was teaching, and joined the party and went to an annual meeting. And I joined the party primarily because Joey Smallwood, who was the first premier of Newfoundland, was still premier then when I was teaching. And he was going to reform his party. The party was really the Smallwood Party from 1949 to 1971. But he was going to reform the party and make it a democratic party. And that's what attracted me to it, because he was going to democratize. He's going to make the party a real political party and not just a one-man party that it had been for 2 decades. And so I was attracted to it. And of course, he had in his cabinet at the time John Crosbie and another premier, Clyde Wells, who later became the premier after me. And I was attracted to the whole idea of it being a democratic party. And so he had a leadership convention, and I supported John Crosbie at the time to become premier of Newfoundland. Isn't this odd? Joey Smallwood won the convention, but it wasn't an honest convention. He was still very much in control of everything that went on. And so right after, not too long afterwards, I left the party because I could not stay with the party which alleged that it was democratic, and it was not. And experienced that through being a campaign manager for John Crosby when he ran for the Liberal leadership in 1968. And so I left and joined the fledgling Conservative Party in that riding that I later won, where I was able to identify 5 or 6 Conservatives after seeking around and just finding out. And I became president of that local district association very quickly thereafter. Actually became the campaign manager for the Conservative candidate in the fall of 1971 and increased the Conservative vote significantly from where it ever had been, largest vote ever the Conservative got, but the Conservative still lost. That was in October 1971, and then I ran in March 1972 and won. So my backdrop to politics should also include that excerpt and a little dally with the Liberal Party of Newfoundland, which I quickly left when I found that it had no democratic roots to it whatsoever. So here we are. So I'll stop there for a minute, and you might want to butt in with
Yeah, I have a few impressions. One is that when you were talking about your affinity to island life, I was thinking about a Simon and Garfunkel song about I am a rock, I am an island. A rock feels no pain, and an island never cries. The other
I've got
impression,
it right here. I've got it right here.
yeah.
I
The other
got it
impression
right
I had was how remarkable it is that you would remember a student from that long ago. That says a great deal about what kind of a teacher you were.
I
That you
remember
made
most of my students.
such right, and
I remember most
so
of my students.
right, and it also explains, because what kind of a teacher you were, and it also explains why you made such an indelible impression on your student. And I expect you must have taught him something of Voltaire, because he remembered what Voltaire said about I may disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death
Right.
your right to say it.
Why
The
are
other
you bringing up all of the people that I admire?
well, it seems maybe we're
we
kindred
have,
souls, Brian. We're
I
we're
think
finding out
we're very kindred souls.
yes, and it's funny. I'm gonna put one more nail in that coffin, in that when you were describing how much you love the legislature and you were drawn to it, you're drawn to the action of it. I'm going to guess you even like the smell of it and the architecture and the sense of just being there in the action. As you know, I'm a constitutional lawyer, and so many of my colleague lawyers, they don't want to go to court.
Yes.
And if I took out legislature and put in court in what you were describing, that is exactly what drew me to the court, because that's where all the action is.
Yeah.
And so it's there where you get to be on the front lines and making arguments, constructing arguments, using the oral art of persuasion, which is obviously employed legally in the same way as politically. And it sounds to me like but for maybe a wise judgment on your part, you could have been drawn into the vortex of law.
Well,
You probably would have been.
my wife tells me every day.
Right.
And other people have too. And after my first year in university, I went out teaching, because a lot of people were telling me then, you really should be a lawyer, Brian.
Yeah. Well,
and I went out teaching and really loved teaching, and so went back and finished my degree in teaching.
Well, I suppose in a way, you have been a teacher, right? A teacher of sorts in a broad sense. But Brian, as you were talking, I mean, obviously you brought up your life is really an example of the rich history of Canadiana, and I want to take you back a little bit, because I want to mine some of these nuggets, and I want to take you all the way back to when you were 7 years old, and you talked about. Are you able to remember what was going on? The sensation, the feelings that were going on in Newfoundland around the time when you described this vote, this referendum, and of course you lived through another referendum later on when you're Premier of Newfoundland, and the 1980 Levesque referendum. But can you give us a sense of what was going on? Like, I know you're only 7 years old, but you remember your feeling at that time? I mean, did you have a sense of patriotism about wanting to be part of a bigger country? Was there a sense of lament that something unique and historical, culturally about Newfoundland was being left behind?
Most people, when I got into politics, and especially when I became premier, many people, I should say, I don't know about most, but a lot of people thought I was a closet nationalist.
Uh-huh. The dirty word in Newfoundland, maybe.
And they were a lot right, because I was never. I remember that there was I guess the best word was almost like a commotion. A lot of people were taught when I was a boy, and I remember that time. A lot of people were talking about it, and because Mr. Smallwood's name was so dominant in the Confederation campaign, his name was everywhere. He was fighting for Confederation, and a gentleman by the name of Cashin, surname was the fighting against Confederation. Better said, he was fighting for an independent Newfoundland to go back to independence. And then there was John Crosby's father, who was fighting for economic union with the United States. And so, as a boy, I was never that infatuated with Confederation. I've learned since, of course, being a strong Canadian now, but at the time, I was always a little bit wary, and as a boy and as a teenager. And that manifested itself when I went to university as well, because it seemed to me, for example, I opposed at university the government's program of giving everybody a salary to go to university.
Really? They had that back then?
Smallwood brought it in. And I opposed it. I was one of the few students who opposed getting money from the government.
Showing your conservative values.
Exactly. And showing that I wasn't altogether enamored with the state being so much involved with me.
Right.
And I think that's where that sort of comes from way back, right? And I think it was also learning about my grandfathers and seeing how hard my father worked, and my friends and their fathers work, both as whatever it was they did. I was more attracted to that. I was more attracted to work and people being an individual than I was this group think stuff. And as I say, I opposed getting the money. I wanted to borrow the money and pay it back. And that's what I did. I wanted to borrow the money and pay it back. And so from early on, then so those are my early recollections. I ran for student council. Murphy and I were on the same student council. We ran, and yes, and I used to hold debates in the common room. Very often I would miss class because I would hold forth on some concept, some idea, and then get somebody to be on one side and somebody on the other side and have these great debates in the common room, and then not go to class and debating both sides of the issue and all of that. So I come by it sort of naturally. I guess it's just my natural inclination. My father had a nickname for me. He called me Digger.
Very apropos. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I've been digging ever since.
Digging in, digging out.
Yeah, exactly.
Digging. So that's very fascinating. So when you were talking about those debates, was that during your time at Memorial?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I went and joined the debating society, and joined in on regular sort of more formalized debates as I went through university. So yeah, and then part of the student council and so on. So and actually started the first student council in my high school before I went to university. So, I come by it naturally. It was for some reason I just couldn't stand by and not get involved. And okay, we don't have a student council, but we have certain rights and privileges, or we have certain things that we think are important that we should get across to the faculty or to the high school teachers. So from an early age, I guess I tended to want to get involved.
Yeah. So you were a bit of a political prodigy, and actually, that made me think of something I heard recently. One of your contemporaries, Preston Manning. I heard a podcast that he said recently. He's got grandsons in hockey, and he says, he says my grandsons are really good young hockey players, and you go to the rinks, and the rinks are just full of scouts trying to find all the best hockey players. And Mr. Manning, he was consternated. He couldn't understand why there aren't people going out trying to find, young Brian Peckfords, the
Yeah.
ones who are seeking out the debating society, who are, want to get involved or interested. And it may be his theory, with which I happen to agree, is that may explain why we have such a, let's say, a paucity of sound leadership, maybe an explosion of mediocrity at the political level. We just don't have. I don't want to paint them all with the same brush, but we certainly don't have the level of leadership that we had in your era. Right?
Absolutely not. And
No.
you're so right on. That's a really good point that Mr. Manning made. And I'm glad he's still participating, because we need more like Preston who are quiet. The two former prime ministers come to mind who, I was involved with, both Mulroney and Harper, who are silent through all of this period when the Charter of Rights and Freedom, the Constitution's under attack, and they're nowhere to be found. I mean, it's so sad. But Mr. Manning, and that point is an extremely interesting point, right? That there's nobody going around to universities or whatever looking for scouting out people who may make good leaders.
We need them a lot more than we need. Yeah, I mean, no offense to Connor McDavid, but we need a John Diefenbaker right now a lot more than we need a Connor McDavid.
Well said, and I'm glad you brought up Diefenbaker, because this whole question of Canada and being formed in 1867 with 4 units: Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Upper and Lower Canada, which became Ontario and Quebec, and the 1867 Constitution, which didn't have anything in there about written rights and freedoms, which came much later. And it was John Diefenbaker, the Prairie Prime Minister from Saskatchewan, who introduced the Bill of Rights. Of course, the Bill of Rights was a federal act, and therefore only applied under federal jurisdiction. And therefore, that's what made necessary the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, if you will. If you wanted to have a written rights and freedoms, then it was through a constitutional act that you had to do it in order to cover all of Canada. One of the biggest problems we got in Canada right now, from a sort of conceptual point of view, is that when people think of Canada and think of federal and think of national, they think they're the same. That the word national and the word federal get used interchangeably as being synonymous, when of course they're not, because we're a federal state and their powers are shared between the provinces and the federal government. Federal means federal, provincial means provincial, and national means federal and provincial together, and is what the Constitution is all about, as opposed to a federal act.
Right.
But I always say in all my speeches, and I give due notice to John Diefenbaker. I wish you could have been at a couple of my speeches now that you quoted John Diefenbaker and mentioned his name, because I never leave him out.
Really?
I never leave him out, because it was really the first time that in writing we had in Canada, in law, some kind of law, the concepts of freedom of speech and a charter or a Bill of Rights. And so he is to be commended for making that important in 1960. Of course, 1867, 1960, the Americans had that was formed as a country in 1776, had a Bill of Rights in, I think it was 1791. So it wasn't very long after that they had a Bill of Rights. There are, of course, as you know, there are people around who debate whether Bill of Rights or Charter Rights should be done at all, and they go back to British common law and stuff. And there are some people in Canada who I think are hurting my cause in elevating or trying to defend the charter, who are sort of taking the view, well, perhaps a charter is not what we needed at all. We should just have what we always had, which was an unwritten British common law tradition with our conventions and customs, and that would serve us in good stead. And I must say, I lament that that has happened, and that there are lawyers around in Canada who are making a big point about that. And of course, I understand their point in that, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, that in the present circumstance of the last 2 years, unfortunately, a number of courts at the lower level have ruled in favor of the governments against the charter. And this has led some people and some lawyers to say that it's all over, and that therefore the charter doesn't really mean all that. My argument back is that you just mentioned Conor McDavid. My argument back is that we're in the latter part of the second period, and that the game is not over yet. We've got all the third period to play, because it has to go to the courts of appeal, and it has to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. And you and me can influence both the judges as well as the politicians between now and when the final decision is made.
I love that metaphor. I when I watched your interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson, whom I admire greatly, you brought that up, and I thought, wow, he just nailed it. One of the things that, and you know, again, I should reveal a couple of my own biases, Brian. Firstly, my admiration for Mr. Diefenbaker might stem from the fact that I was born in Regina, and he was a lawyer. So, full disclosure, I'm biased. I admire Mr. Diefenbaker very much. So, go ahead.
I heard him speak
in
St. John's, Newfoundland, back in 1958, 59.
Oh.
I deliberately, you will love this, I deliberately sought it out.
Really?
Yes. I heard he was in St. John's, and I made sure I got there.
That was one of the questions. That was one of the questions I want to ask you, actually. I want to come back to the charter next, but one other little piece I wanted to sort of mine out of your history is you mentioned that you love teaching. You really enjoyed it. You love the engagement with students, that intellectual connection. But something drew you out of teaching, and you said that there were circumstances that were going on in Newfoundland at that time that drew you into politics, that you felt drawn to it. And the impression I had from that, what you said was that you felt you could make a difference. And so I wanted to know what was going on in Newfoundland at that time, which drew you away from a vocation that you really loved.
Well, it happened at university first, but that was just one, like a sort of incident, the business of the government going to pay for my education. I wouldn't have to pay it back, give me an education without any, that was sort of went against my nature. But then when I went on and finished university and went out teaching, I had a unique, as you can tell already, had a sort of an unusual kind of circumstance in that not only was I born in rural Newfoundland and went out teaching in Newfoundland, I forgot to mention, and now you've just brought it back to me full bore. For the years that I went to university, I had to earn enough money to help pay for my education. And I was determined to do that. And therefore, I had to get a job every summer. Now, where was I going to get a job? I'm not mechanical. My dad wasn't mechanical. I admire tradesmen a lot because I couldn't be a tradesman. So I had to try to find a job. And I remember, because my dad was a social worker and we were in rural Newfoundland growing up. And I remember him saying, how difficult it was to get social workers to go to rural Newfoundland, especially very remote places in Newfoundland. And so it dawned on me when I went to university during my first year, I got to get a job for the summer and I got to earn some money to come back to university in the fall. And so unbeknownst to my father, I went to the department, as it was called at the time, social services, and asked who should I speak to get a job for the next summer. And they put me on to the director of field services, as he was called at the time. And so I went in and had a meeting. I asked for an appointment and I got one. I had a meeting with the director of field services, which, no student usually did that. That was sort of highly unusual. So he wanted to know why I was there. And I told him I was there to get a job for the next summer. He said, Peckford, that's not possible. He said, those things are filled up so fast. He said, kids, and of course also that a lot of the people who had connections would get the jobs. I had a connection, but I wasn't using it. That was my dad. Mm. But I said to him, sir, I said, I'm willing to go anywhere. And he said, say that again? And I said, I'm willing to go anywhere, sir. He said, you mean to tell me you will go to a community in Newfoundland, northern Newfoundland, that has no road, perhaps no electricity for the summer, and replace the permanent welfare officer who's there? And I said, absolutely, sir. Oh, well, he said, fill out this form. So I filled out the form, and I made sure I put on it what I had said to him. So I got a call the next spring. I went in to see him, and he said, I have your application here. But he said, are you serious about wanting still that job? He said, I have a job, because he said most kids want to go to St. John's and Corner Brook and Grand Falls and places, big towns, but they don't want to go to where it's going to be isolated for the summer and have to go by boat everywhere and all that kind of stuff. And I said, yes, sir, I'll go. Well, he said, you have the job. Here's some material for you to study for the next week or so, and then come back when your last exams are over. And you got the job to be this temporary social worker in Lassie, Newfoundland, northeastern Newfoundland, for the summer. So every summer thereafter, I went to isolated places in Newfoundland until I graduated.
What a great preparation for your eventual
So I was in
premiership of the
Mary's
province.
Harbour, I was in St. Anthony, I was in Anglia, I was in Lassie, I was in Port Saunders, I was in Burgeo, besides being in the other communities that I was in growing up with my father being in rural Newfoundland. By the way, when I was a Liberal and they had the first meeting of the district association in my riding before I became a Conservative, Joey Smallwood, the Premier, came to that meeting to get his person elected president of the district association. I knew then, of course, that the jig was up, that democratization was not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And his candidate, I went to the meeting not knowing this, going to join the party, made out my membership at the door, went in and sat down. There were 102 people in the hall who were eligible to vote. He put forward his candidate, nominated his candidate, which I guess technically wasn't allowed because he wasn't a member of the district association, even though he was the leader of the party. Anyway, I said to a person in front of me, get up and nominate me. The guy looked at me. He said, you sure? I said, yeah. Would you do it? So I took him sort of off guard. So we got up before I guess he knew what he was doing and nominated me to run against Smallwood's candidate for the presidency of that district association. When we got up, when we got ready to vote, I got up in my place and said, Mr. Chairman, I think that the two candidates for the presidency of this district association should address the audience and should explain why they want to be president of this district association. Somebody seconded. It got voted on. And the vote passed. And Smallwood got up in his place. Here's the Premier of Newfoundland. Now, here's me, just a young teacher, unknown to anybody. And said, gave a speech in favor of his candidate. And And of course, there was shuffling around at the 102 in the hall about, oh my God, right? And everybody pretty nervous. So I got up and made a motion that the two of us should speak in alphabetical order. His name was Clark, C minus Peckford, P, in alphabetical. I would be the last one to speak.
Good strategy.
Which got accepted. So he got up and speak, and he wasn't a good speaker. He just wasn't a good speaker. He was a local merchant.
Did you know that at the time?
Yes.
Wise like your father.
Oh, yeah. I knew I could. So I got up second. And what I talked about was all the places I had visited in Newfoundland over the previous year. I totally startled Smallwood. Totally startled him. And talked about the fishery on the Labrador coast, the fishery on the northeast coast, the fishery on the French shore, the fishery in southern Newfoundland, the sociological issues that were foremost, how these people were being denied proper transportation when over the years we had 20 years of Confederation and we still didn't have the basic services in many parts of Newfoundland. Why was this so? And so he tried to interrupt me a few times, Smallwood did. And I would not allow him to interrupt me. And of course, the place was now almost, pretty well upset. I lost the vote 52-50. The only election I ever lost.
Smallwood voted twice.
Good question. So I could hold my own even then.
Right. You obviously, though, it sounds like, notwithstanding your, let's call it a dalliance with the Liberal Party, which we'll forgive, you always had small c conservative values.
No question.
And when you got up and you're speaking in front of that group, that's really what you were talking about. And
yeah.
And I think perhaps you'll agree with me that this is really what's missing from the Canadian political discourse right now. As I said, I think that many of the leaders we have right now, I would describe them as mediocre, and they're unable to bring the sense of Canadian values to the fore. And so something very, very important is missing from the discourse. And I want to connect up a couple of things and get you to comment on this. I want to turn to the charter, but a little bit obliquely. I don't know if you're familiar with great British scholar, Dr. Roger Scruton. He passed away a few years ago, sadly, from cancer, but he's just a brilliant. If anybody is listening to this would read his books. Oh, yes. Here we go. I'm sorry to say, Brian, I'm your long lost son. But Dr. Roger Scruton wrote everything he wrote was brilliant. And
yes, it was.
If anybody's not familiar, just a towering intellect. He was scholarly in literature, architecture, wines. He was an Cambridge educated lawyer. Really had a deep understanding of the common law. But he wrote a wonderful book. Many of his books are wonderful. One that he wrote was called "How to Be a Conservative."
I have it here on my iPad.
Right. So I'm going to draw. This is great. I'm going to draw a piece from that. And in that book, he talks about what it means to be a conservative. And when I read this, I was very struck because I had never heard it before. People throw around the word conservative. It's in the name of the Conservative Party, although I don't think anyone in that party right now understands it.
Yeah.
But Dr. Roger Scruton, the late Dr. Roger Scruton, he connected conservative and he defined it in terms of beauty. And this is what he said. He said, what does a conservative do? In first principles, what is a conservative? Well, a conservative conserves. Okay, what does a conservative conserve? A conservative conserves all the things, the repositories, sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Yes. We start from there and we say, well, all the things of value that have been conveyed to us and imbued to us by our forebears, by our grandparents, our ancestors, the British common law. We're talking about art, we're talking about literature, we're talking about language. We're talking about our institutions, everything that is beautiful in the sense that it makes us feel good. We have a sense of home. He called it oikophilia from the Greek, oikophilia, which is a love of home.
Yeah.
And when I listen to you, I have a sense that you have a keen understanding of this. And then I want to connect that up with the charter, because when I talking about your frustration about people who don't understand this,
Yeah.
when I look at the Bill of Rights and I look at the charter, I frame that in the context of what Dr. Roger Scruton was talking about. I see those documents, as just speaking specifically about the charter, as a statement of values that are ancient, they're important, and they're part of the fabric of Canadian society. It's really a statement of Canadian values, and
Yes.
that's why they're fundamental. And I get a sense that that's why people like you felt so strongly that they must be enshrined, that they must be passed on from generation to generation to generation, because they're central to the character and the conservation of our nation. Are you seeing where I'm going with this?
Oh, totally. No, totally
Okay.
on side. Totally
Okay.
on side. And
Okay.
as a matter of fact, the word values I've used quite often in most of my speeches.
Right.
That the Constitution represents the glue which keeps the country together. It's our values. And in the book Coercing Virtue by Robert Bork,
Oh, yes. Yeah.
which no doubt you're familiar with.
Brilliant. Yes.
That's
Great
also
book.
mentioned.
Well,
The permanent values.
on this podcast, I may as well let you know, spoiler alert, Brian, at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to give a short reading list, or one or two selections from your library there that you would recommend to people to sort of be able to carry on this discussion, for themselves.
Yeah.
But I want to go just follow this up. A big difference between the generation of politicians that you were a part of. Let's take somebody you would have really disagreed with. For example, René Lévesque. Say what you like about René Lévesque. He talked values. I mean, you could disagree with what is talking about Voltaire. I'm sure you disagreed with what Mr. Lévesque was saying. However, you had to admire his fervor, his conviction. And when he talked about Quebec, he talked about values. He wasn't talking about the same types of things that the Bloc Québécois, for example, are talking about today, where they want to have a political advantage. Do you agree?
Oh, totally. In my longer conversations like this one, and yesterday with the Manitoba students, I pointed out they wanted me to go back when they saw the names on the sheet, because I put the sheet up for the charter, or for the patriation agreement that we talked about early on.
Right.
And I went through all of the names.
Could we stop there and just, Devin, could you put that up, because to show that to we have that there.
Here are all the names of the premiers who signed the patriation agreement in 81, which authorized the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution Act that came the next year. Without this being signed, there would be no Constitution Act of 1982. There would be no Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is encompassed in that, okay? And a lot of people have been going down rabbit holes about, nothing was ever signed and all this kind of stuff. And I spent half a day, most days, just taking people out of rabbit holes to say this is real and this was passed and this is the law of Canada. But to come to your point, I did go through the names yesterday, and I spent more time with René Lévesque than I did with anybody else, because René Lévesque, in our meetings, was the most charming of the first ministers, if you will. And not charming in a false way, but charming in a very substantial way. This was a man who understood the world. René Lévesque was one of those people who could, if you mentioned a little atoll in the Pacific Ocean, could tell you its history and its geography. You mention any country in the world, and he could do the same thing. And not only like history and geography in a cold statistical sense, but in a more cultural sense. He could talk about the people of that particular place. And remember, he was a foreign correspondent for some time before he got into politics. But he was the most interesting of people, okay? More than any other of the first ministers. And I said to the students yesterday that, notwithstanding his view on the Constitution, or as it related to Quebec's place in Canada, or a place wherever it was on the planet, he was a most interesting person by far. And we spent a lot of time together, Rennie and I. We spent a time together on Lake Champlain in the state of Vermont, floating out on a yacht, talking about Churchill Falls and the hydro development, for example. Just he and I.
Mm-hmm.
He loved his scotch, by the way. He loved his scotch. But he was a very interesting person. And when we were at the First Ministers' meetings, the only person who would really make us laugh was René Lévesque. He could tell stories all day long. And he was sitting right next to the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, being such a cold, right, person, was so jealous of René when René would take the floor, because he knew that René was going to make us laugh, as well as make us cry, if he wanted to, in the sense of where the country was going and so on. But he was a full person. In literature, years ago, I remember a couple of professors talking about round characters and flat characters in novels, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a round character and a flat character. Of course, the flat character was really nobody. The author didn't do a very good job in bringing this so-called character to life to be a real person in the literature. Whereas a round character was a fully developed character. Well, René Lévesque was a round character. Trudeau was more on the flat side.
Well, I
But there
think
were other characters. Angus MacLean of Prince Edward Island, whose name is on there.
Mm-hmm.
Angus MacLean, by the way, who became premier of the PEI during that time, was a Veterans Affairs Minister in John Diefenbaker's cabinet.
Oh, really?
Yes. He had been a veteran. He had been in the war. And he had left and gone back to his farm, mainly a berry farm on Prince Edward Island. And the Conservatives took him out of retirement, or took him out of his job again, after he had served as a minister of the cabinet of Canada, and brought him back to be leader of the Conservative Party, because they thought he could win the next election, which he did, became premier, and became part of the 10 premiers that were at the Constitutional Conference in 1981 and signed the Patriation Agreement. Another round character. Angus MacLean didn't say much. He wasn't an orator, but he was a full person. And when he said a sentence, you listened to every syllable, because it was meaningful. It had stuff in it. It was full of stuff. I got to know him very well. And by the way, he got to know René Lévesque very well. And in his book that nobody in the rest of Canada, I guess, has read, MacLean did write a book, he talks about René Lévesque in affectionate terms, the same way as I do outside of my fight with him over Churchill Falls and over the vision for the country. But otherwise, he was quite a character. Alan Blakeney and Peter Lougheed also had a lot of those characteristics. Bill Bennett, to some degree, strong Canadian, and him and his constitutional advisor at the time, Mel Smith, really understood Canada and had a better sense of where you and I are than most of the others. So did Lougheed and Blakeney. Blakeney was a bit of a policy wonk. He might have been a premier, but he was more of a policy guy, strong policy guy. Presbyterian, I think, by heritage in the sense of his spirituality, but a strong and in many ways very conservative. Very, very conservative. We often said, some of us conservative premiers, said, come on over, Alan, come on over, man. You know, what you're saying there now is more conservative than all of your socialist leanings that you have. Come on over here. You're more conservative. And he was a very interesting character too. And they would stand out. MacLean and Lévesque first, and then Blakeney and Sterling Lyon was one of those premiers who was also strongly an interesting person, because he always was the cautionary person in the group. And he thought that there would be governments come by and try to usurp the charter. I think he was the only one. And I've often mentioned him in my speeches. He often cautioned us. He said, I agree with what you're doing, but he says, I've got to tell you that my view is that, and of course, given what happened in the last 2 years, he was right. There would be governments come along and even not only violate regular laws, but violate the Constitution. And so, yeah, there were some really interesting characters. And the other thing about them was, as was Rennie, and I think Lougheed, and to a lesser extent Blakeney, but also Blakeney, and particularly in my case, they were leaders in this sense that you talked about earlier. If I believed in something, it's my job to go out and sell it. The art of politics, the art of persuasion. Leadership is about persuasion. This is where the legislature comes back in again, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's persuading people. When I go into the House with a bill, and you knew you had perhaps most of your people on side, but I'd always like to see if I could persuade somebody on the other side before the debate was over to join in this, because I believed that this was advantageous to the province to pass this bill.
Right.
Okay. And we're lacking that. Most of the time on the issues like offshore oil and gas that I fought, and on fisheries, I was fighting from behind. My first election as premier, I was fighting from behind as I was a leadership, but I won the election because I persuaded the majority of people that my course was better than the opposition leader's course. After I called the election, the Liberal Party of Newfoundland, my first election, persuaded, talking about persuading, or cajoled or whatever, Don Jameson, who was then the External Affairs Minister for Trudeau, to come back to Newfoundland. He was an MP from Newfoundland, to come back to Newfoundland, very, very popular politician, and run against me. And he did. And the day he landed at the Torbay Airport in St. John's, it was the largest motorcade in Newfoundland's history that greeted him at the airport. And the next morning, my staff and other people, elections come. We're down to 20 days, 21-day election. We're down to 20 days or 20 or 19 days, I think. I think it was a couple of days before he got back. We're down to 18, 19 days to election day. And they came in and sat and they said, well, Skipper, I guess we tried, didn't we? More or less. I said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Well, you know about what happened yesterday, the motorcade. Jameson's back. He's just been crowned leader. He's been crowned leader. And he had the largest motorcade in Newfoundland's history. And we did an overnight poll. And you're behind him by double digits. I said, now listen here. You're either for me or you're against me. If you're against me, out the door. I want no more talk. The word failure does not exist. The word loss does not exist. It has been taken completely out of your vocabulary from this day forward. And I shall win 18 days from now.
And you did.
And I won a majority government 18 days later.
It's funny you should say that, Brian, because I heard a story from a lady who worked in Premier Lougheed's office when he was premier. And that word you just used, failure, was the only word you could not say. So it seems both you and he were not only round characters, but spherical, three-dimensionally round.
Absolutely.
So I want to bring you into the milieu of the foundation of the charter, and talking about this oikophilia. A lot of people don't realize they talk about the charter, but you gentlemen of that era were actually repatriating the Constitution. You were bringing the Constitution home from Britain, the old British North America Act. And that was an important piece of it too. And the charter actually, in contemporary terms, as I recall, was a bit of an afterthought. The big thing was repatriation of the Constitution. But what I wanted to talk to you about is what was your role in shaping and fashioning the charter? I know you were very, very intimately involved in constructing the language in certain parts of the charter. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I would like to. I think the first thing people have to recognize is that, as I said at the beginning of this interview, this was a bargain, and the charter is part one of 7 parts to the Constitution Act. Fundamental to that, and as you say, the early talks were about patriation. In other words, bringing the Constitution home, as you said, and being able to amend it in Canada. But what had happened from John Diefenbaker in 1960 to 1982 was that nobody could come up with, everybody wanted to patriate the Constitution and become a completely sovereign nation, no more having to go back to England to amend anything. How are you going to do it when you get back home? How are you going to amend it? We had to have an amending formula. So one of the other key components of the Constitution Act is the amending formula. And previous, from 1960 to 1981, various attempts were tried to come up with an amending formula. Remember the Pepin-Robarts Commission? I think it was Pepin-Robarts. He was a federal minister, and I think it was the former premier of Ontario. Anyway, there were a number of attempts made to come up with an amending formula. All failed. All the provinces and the federal government couldn't agree on an amending formula. So that delayed that from happening earlier. But by 1981, there was a feeling amongst most of the first ministers and the prime minister that patriation was possible. And so that brought together everybody. And of course, also at the time was talked about because of the Americans and because of our Bill of Rights. It wasn't done in isolation. Because the elephant to the south, the mouse always looked at and heard on their televisions and so on as time went on and technology got better and we had more of an integration communication-wise with the United States about this Bill of Rights, everybody standing up for their Bill of Rights in the United States. And of course, we had the Bill of Rights, which was a federal act in Canada. So there was some history and experience knowing about other places and knowing about our own Bill of Rights. So the charter then became part of the talks as well. And so remember, that was a 17-month ordeal. Most people don't realize today when you talk about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that it wasn't an easy piece of work. It was a very difficult piece of work because it was involved with other things. Those other things being the amending formula, and then got entered into the picture Aboriginal rights and equalization and regional disparity, and the provinces being concerned about renewable, especially non-renewable resources and their jurisdiction over it. Minority language rights came into the picture. When we began talking about patriation and charter, we all had our individual lists of what we wanted to see in an amended constitution. It boiled down at one point to 20, and then it got down to 12 over the 17 months. The other thing that colored, and you can put whatever color you like on it, but what colored what came out as the Constitution Act 82 and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was the fact that the Prime Minister left the table, left the negotiations. We had started negotiating, we're into negotiations. I had so many, Peter Law, he had so many, and we had 20 or more, and the Prime Minister was frustrated by all of this. He just wanted the patriation and the charter. Some days he wanted the charter, other days he didn't, even though everybody thinks today he was the great guy who wanted the charter. It was depending on what day, because he was a very volatile guy that way, very stubborn. But in any case, when all of the provinces got together and we started to see where I was coming from and where Blakeney was coming from and all the provinces were coming from, that frustrated the Prime Minister. And then we gradually whittled that down in the list as provinces began to become more interested in the nation than in their province. And this happened. This happened with Lyon. This happened with all of the premiers. We became more nation-oriented than provincial-oriented or federal-oriented. I think that concerned Trudeau at the time too, because at the beginning of being the federal government, he was standing for the nation. We were only standing for the provinces. I think that upset the media at the time too, and that's why we got the names put on us later on, which I'll come to in a second. And so the Prime Minister up and left the table here we were negotiating this thing and said, I'm going to do it on my own. And this is an extremely important part of our history that's being missed in this whole debate about the Charter now and the Constitution Act, because it colored a lot of our thinking. There were some of us in that group of 10 who said right from the start that Trudeau will not stay at the table. Naive people like me, and I think even at the time, Blakeney and I don't know about Lougheed now, but Levesque for sure, and perhaps some people in the British Columbia delegation and some in the Alberta delegation said he's going to leave the table. And we said, no. He's agreed to sit down. We started the negotiations. We're months into the negotiations. He's not going to do it. So when he did, we were surprised. But we were more surprised because we thought he'd come back to the table when he delivered on his threat to us. I'll do it alone, and I'll bring in my own resolution through the House of Commons, through the Parliament of Canada. I'll do this on my own, and I'll have my own Charter of Rights and Freedoms and a patriation, full stop. So he left the table, went to the House of Commons, got a bill passed, doing what he wanted to do, and then that's when the provinces split, and this is very, very important. We split 8-2. 2 provinces stayed with the Prime Minister, New Brunswick and Ontario. The other 8 started with 6, and then the other 2 came on more or less quickly. Saskatchewan especially was sort of half with us and half against us for a while. But it ended up being 8-2, and that's what the press began to call the Gang of 8. We were a gang because, in their view, being against the federal government was being against the nation.
Some things haven't changed.
No, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And so he went and passed his resolutions on, and then we challenged him in court. And we took it to 3 courts, as I remember, Newfoundland, Quebec, and Manitoba, I think. It became clear then to the Prime Minister that this wasn't a slam dunk that he might have thought when he left the table and when he went in the House of Commons and did this. The Conservatives were kicking up a bit of fuss about it, and his own party were kicking up a bit of fuss about it. And so he decided that he would refer to the Supreme Court of Canada, which was his right, and our 3 actions through the 3 courts got melded into one big case before the Supreme Court of Canada. Does the federal government of Canada have the right to patriate the Constitution and add a Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Is it constitutional for them to do that? And that's what we argued in the 3 courts. And on September, I think, 28th, 1981, Supreme Court of Canada ruled, which the federal government tries to sort of mush into some kind of, it was legal, but it wasn't constitutional. The court ruled it was unconstitutional what the Prime Minister was doing. And so therefore he was forced back to the table, and that's when we get to the 3 days of November 3rd, 4th, and 5th, which was the last 3 days were either going to make or break. This was it. It was either going to have a patriation and a charter, or we were not. And so that's what happened. So that whole period of negotiation, 17 months, and the break and the constitutional reference and the Supreme Court of Canada decision must all be considered, as well as the other issues that were outstanding, appeal, right, the amending formula, Aboriginal rights, all the rest of it, came together into this 3 days of intense negotiations, right? And day 1, 3rd of November, nothing. Prime Minister wouldn't move. He just dug in to what his position was earlier. And the provinces began late on the 3rd, and I haven't emphasized this enough perhaps in a lot of my talks. So we appointed a delegation to go privately and see the Prime Minister and demonstrate to him that in certain areas of those 7 or 8 areas, we could make some movement. He was totally adamant against anything we said. He wasn't going to budge, even though we had demonstrated we were going to. We got that meeting with him, by the way, through Ontario and New Brunswick, who were on his side. And so our delegation came back from that meeting late on the 3rd and said, you know, this guy's just not going to move an inch. So then the next day came the 4th, and we all met again with different proposals from, I think, Saskatchewan at the time and British Columbia. Put proposals on the table before all the First Ministers, all of which was rejected. So by the afternoon of the 4th, it was pretty gloomy. We only had 1 day to go, and things were not looking very bright. That's when I wrote down on a piece of paper, and I have all the documents here, including that final document which you showed. I wrote down a piece of paper several ideas that I had of where compromise seemed possible to me. Showed it to my delegation that evening. They took it and worked on it, came back, had it enlarged to me, all in our hotel. So I said, well, why don't we call up Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and Alberta and see what they think. Does this have a chance to fly? And so I sent 2 of my deputy ministers over to the Chateau Laurier, where the Saskatchewan Premier was staying, in his suite, Saskatchewan suite. We met. And we had a representative from British Columbia, Mel Smith. We had a representative from Alberta, Peter Meekinson, the Premier of Saskatchewan, Alan Blakeney, and Howard Leeson, one of his deputies. And my deputies showed them this. They knew it was coming because I had tried to present what I had scratched down that afternoon and mention it to a couple of delegations. And they knew I was very agitated about not getting a chance to present it. And this comes up in documents later that were filed by BC. So they were aware that we were working on something as a delegation. So all of them said, boy, you know what? This may have legs. This may work. And so, you sure? And so I didn't go deliberately because I wanted to keep my powder dry in case I had to go over later to argue for some of the points. So they said, yeah. So they started to work on it a little bit. And so then we brought in Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, Manitoba to the talks. We went to the Quebec suite. We knew where they were staying. Knocked on the door. My late Minister of Justice, Jerry Ottenheimer, because he could speak French. He could speak 7 languages, as a matter of fact. Honors Law, Cambridge, Jerry Ottenheimer. Doctorate, Sorbonne, Masters, McGill. This was one of my advisors. So people will know that while I'm not a lawyer, I'm imbued with having on both sides of me in the legislature and in the cabinet some really good people who knew jurisprudence and knew the law. So I learned it by osmosis, as I say. No Quebec delegation. They weren't there. So this myth about the Night of the Long Knives is just that, a myth. We tried to contact the delegation, and they were all, to a person, over in Hull having a late dinner, which was confirmed to me later by the Quebec delegation. Confirmed to me back in 2012 when I went to a constitutional conference at the University of Montreal. And this guy comes up to see me, and he says, Mr. Peckford, I've always wanted to meet you. I said, yes, He said, I want to meet you because I wanted to confirm to you I was a part of the Quebec delegation. And yes, we were in Hull and we were at a restaurant there. And what you said is correct. So we worked on the Newfoundland proposal through the evening, rest of the evening to 12 or 1 o'clock at night. Finally got it where all the provinces who were represented then agreed, but that all the first ministers needed to see it because how many premiers were there that night? Brian Peckford from Newfoundland, John Buchanan from Nova Scotia, Angus MacLean from Prince Edward Island, Alan Blakely from Saskatchewan. That's the premiers that were there that night. Now, most books got it that there were just officials there. There were no premiers there. That's how many premiers were actually there. Okay. Mercier from Manitoba contacted Lyon. Meekison contacted Lougheed. Mel Smith contacted Bennett. So they were on the phone to them during that night. But they all agreed that everybody had to see it the next morning. Well, the next morning wasn't a problem because the group of 8 always met at breakfast every morning while we were there, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th. We met every morning anyway. So the morning, the 5th was no different. The group were going to meet before we met everybody else. Okay. So that meeting was already scheduled. So I would bring this final document agreed to by the people that night that I would present it. Why? Because I had presented the original document that got amended to all of the first minute, to the group of 8 the next morning. So Levesque would be there because he was part of the group of 8. So he was shown the final document before the meeting began and his delegation so that they had time to look at it. And they indicated before the meeting even started, they had problems with it. It's quite likely they would not vote for it. So then I convened the meeting and said, here's what we've been working on overnight. You all know. You've all seen the document overnight because your people brought it back to your delegation, brought it back to you during the night. You've had time to look at it. What do you think? And to a person, except for Quebec, they agreed no more amendments. This is as good as we're going to make it. We got a meeting lined up with all of the first ministers later in the morning. In other words, federal government, New Brunswick and Ontario would then join in and would be a full First Ministers Conference, and that you, Peckford, are to present the document, which I did, which later that day became the Patriation Act, which is now the Constitution Act of 1982.
I'm very grateful for that history because, if nothing else, it shows us we're talking to the right man. I want to maybe transition into taking now the charter, now that we understand foundationally the importance of the charter, significance of it historically, maybe bring this into a bit more of a modern context. Before I do that, I want to say this, for people like myself and Keith Wilson, who went to law school in the late 80s and early 1990s, the cases, the Supreme Court of Canada cases, the seminal cases that were coming out of the court at that time, were speaking a very different language than the courts are today. And I'm going to ask you to comment on this. In those days, I'm talking about, the Brian Dixon court,
Yeah.
Even into Antonio Lemaire court. They were talking about the charter as a living tree, as being interpreted in a broad, liberal, purposive sense to breathe life and relevance, practical relevance, legal relevance into the charter that you and the other first ministers fashioned. That significance has changed, and I was a little bit horrified recently when I saw an op-ed by our retired, longest-serving Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, who, she's a brilliant lady, but she's sitting on a court over there in China, which is frankly strange. But she delivered this op-ed in the aftermath of the Freedom Convoy. And what she basically said is that Section 1 now is the only effective charter right. In other words, Section 1 trumps all, and she equated those rights to privileges. So I want to take this now back to you So here you are, you're 78 years old, comfortably ensconced in your retirement out on the coast of BC, and along comes COVID. And I, and I want to talk about a couple of things. I'd like to ask you to comment on a couple of things. Firstly, the type of political discourse that you were just describing in great detail is no longer happening in Canada. We're not having these conferences between premiers and prime ministers. We have an appalling concentration of political power in one office and really in one person, it seems. And so that's of concern, because the parliamentary structures, the legislative structures that worked so well for so long in Canada and made us so free and so prosperous, and really, I think, admired throughout the world, are not only not working, they're not even functioning. So that's one problem, and I think that is a big reason why the pandemic flowed the way it did, because of a lack of political discourse. I think we can agree on that. But then, and this is the big key, I want you to talk about, if you could, about Section 1, because I know you've been very outspoken about this, about the concept of demonstrably justified, which is a test that you helped to fashion. Let's call it perhaps your own brainchild. And how it's being applied by courts today, as opposed to, Big M Drug Mart and some of the other, the Southern News and some of the other great charter cases of the early 1980s. So could you comment on that? If you can, I know that that's kind of a loaded question, but if you could fit those pieces together and perhaps tell us what is going on right now in Canada. What's going on with Section 1? Why is the charter seemingly been reduced to really an escape clause for government, to support or justify all manner of really offensive not even legislative, but government edicts, let alone legislation.
Yeah. Two points. One, perhaps I'll deal with it first, and then we'll get into the Section 1. You're right, and one of the things the detail of my speeches is the decline of parliamentary democracy in our nation, and I refer everybody to the book by Donald Savoie, the Democracy in Canada, the Decline of Our Institutions.
There's the reading list, the recommendation for the day.
There's one.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. I'm going to get that one. Thank you.
This is a must read for anybody who wants to understand the political side of the process that we're in now, how it got to here, so that the Prime Minister's office now has 1,600 employees, plus the 7,000 deputy ministers and the 7 assistant deputy ministers. It's gone from 200 to 1,600. The move from a MP being to a now only a social worker, to being a real member of Parliament, being involved in parliamentary committees that have some clout, that cannot be closed down by the majority party every single time they don't like something that's going to come before it. There over the last 40 or 50 years, the movement of power from the Parliament first to the regional ministers and cabinet. Remember, we used to have strong regional ministers. Don Mazinkowski from Alberta, right? Lloyd Axworthy from Manitoba. There were no doubt some from Saskatchewan that were very big ministers. John Crosbie from Newfoundland, Alan McKechen from Nova Scotia, Lalonde and Chrétien from Quebec, and so on. Strong ministers from Ontario, all the way to the Prime Minister's office. So the Parliament now is just a rubber stamp. It's what the government introduces, gets debated. It's what I went to an MP a few years ago just to confirm this, and I said, if you put a private member's bill forward now, how long would it take before we get on the floor of the House of Commons? He said, 2 to 3 years. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on. And if you're in between elections, and it's an election to come up in 2 years from now, it's quite likely you wouldn't get it up before the next Parliament, which would be 3 or 4 years away. And so the role of the MP as being a crucial role in the Parliament of a nation has been diminished. The role of the cabinet has been diminished, all down now to small cabinet committees and the Prime Minister's office. which includes, of course, the Privy Council office, which is really now only a policy forum for the Prime Minister, right? They report to the Prime Minister. So when I talk about the Prime Minister's office, I'm talking about the Prime Minister's office as a political entity, and I'm talking about the Privy Council office as a policy entity, all of whom report to one person, the Prime Minister. So that's what's happened to our democracy. It has diminished. So there's like the conditions for what has happened were being created 40 years ago, right up. So when the pandemic hit, the so-called pandemic hit, there was a fertile ground for a prime minister and a premier to go ahead and do what they did without the complete involvement or even the involvement of their parliaments. So it's happened on the provincial level and it's happened on the federal level. Okay, so the whole nation now is one of premiers and prime ministers with a very limited role for the House of Assembly or the legislature or the Parliament of Canada. Okay, and this has happened over 40 years. It started really with Trudeau, with the Papa Trudeau, with Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. That's when the Prime Minister's office started to take on exercise more power. With the strength of his personality at the time and very strong personalities that he had in his office, Michael Pickford, for example, I remember very well. There were three or four of them in his office. Very strong people, very strong, what I call federalists, or a stronger federal government and a weaker province. Okay, that's what it really boiled down to. They saw the provinces as more of a nuisance than being an integral part of the federal state. Right, that's where they came from. So I'll stop there and then I'll go. Okay, now insofar as Section 1 and the whole living tree thing, I remember some people talking about that vaguely back when we were talking about the charter and putting together this deal. But it was always, we were always advised at the time by a preponderance of experts that this wouldn't happen. That this was not going to be the modus operandi for jurisprudence into the future. Naively. I did a speech, I think at the 30th anniversary of the charter, or around that time, to a group of lawyers in Vancouver. I still have a copy of the speech in which I talked about that at the time, because, it was obvious over the years what has happened, that the living tree doctrine has become the dominant doctrine in law schools and amongst the judiciary, and undermines the whole reason for the thing in the beginning. Most of us at the table at the time were originalists. We thought that because we worked so hard on amending formula, that we thought naively that the changes that the judges are now implementing, right, they're making law, not just interpreting law, in my view, were ones that wouldn't happen, and that in order for it to happen, we would have to go back to the amending formula and sit down and see if we could amend the Constitution. That's the whole reason why the amending formula was so important in the beginning, for God's sake, is because, right? And the whole reason for putting the Charter in the Constitution was to keep it away from early, easy change, because the Constitution represents the permanent values of our society. And I mean, as we got closer and closer to November, and especially after September decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, let me tell you, and let me tell Canadians, there was nobody, not one First Minister, who didn't realize that we were not being premiers. From here on in, we were being First Ministers. We were being First Ministers of Canada.
Right.
So for anybody who ever thought, especially after that Supreme Court of Canada decision, we knew that it was in our hands, that our arguments had been accepted even by Pierre-Elliott Trudeau's friends. I say in my speeches all the time, in 1981, we had a circumstance where the judges were friends of the law first, friends of the Prime Minister second. I wonder, is it true today? That's what I say in my speeches.
Right.
And so what we have lost is what you talked about earlier, is the issue of the concept of a constitution being the permanent values
Right.
of our societies. It's the glue that keeps the country together. That's what's lost. I'm writing an essay right now, by the way, started it yesterday morning, on 3 or 4 elements of Section 1 and the intent of Section 1.
Okay.
Now, the intent of Section 1, when we wrote it, I remember, and by the way, I remember so well the phrase justify, and how several of us wanted to strengthen it, which we did. So this was not done lightly by anybody. This Section 1 was not put in there lightly by anybody. And we even made sure, and I identified them as 4 tests, right? To justify to reasonable limits, by law, free and democratic society, right? And our understanding, complete and utter understanding at the time, and if we had raised it, by the way, why didn't we put this in there? You would have been laughed out of the room because it was self-evident, right? It was to be in when the state was in peril, when there was a war or insurrection or some other circumstance where the state was in peril. That was the word that we used a lot. The state was in peril. That Section 1 would even be entertained or used. And then even in that circumstance, it had to pass those 4 tests. And so to think that the provinces and the federal government and some of the judges in this country are using Section 1 now in this circumstance of 99 plus recovery of a virus, less than 1% fatality rate, as a peril to the state, is completely missing the point of Section 1 and its intent. Now,
And you took the time, as I understand it, to write to every single premier in Canada to tell them that, didn't you? You wrote
yes,
you had your letter writing
yes,
campaign,
yes,
and you were uniformly ignored, right?
ignored. And so, and then I go on to say in my arguments that even if you wanted to, for argument's sake, in a law school or somewhere, debate Section 1 as applying, none of the governments of Canada have met those tests. Demonstrably justify. Demonstrably justify to me, and I'm putting this in my essay, means, and this is very common throughout all of Canada and throughout all of the democratic world, to demonstrably justify would mean, well, some kind of cost-benefit analysis. That's very much a part of the toolbox of every public institution in this country.
Including
right?
public health, right?
Cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
We did it in when I was premier in cabinet many times. Okay, Minister, this, you got a good idea there that your department wants to bring in as a legislation. Why don't you go back and do some more work on this, like a cost-benefit analysis, and make it public, right? This was not done by any of the 14 governments in this country when they had to mitigate or approach what they were going to do as related to the virus. This was not done. So they didn't even meet that test. Now, the other thing is, as an English major, you and I, and you'll see this in my essay, which I'll send you. You'll see this in my essay. Let's look at that Section 1. The operative words in that sentence is poorly constructed, I guess, but as a grammar teacher, right, is demonstrably justify.
Right.
That's the verb. That's the predicate. That's the verb. That's the active phrase in that whole sentence.
Right.
Now, a lot of lawyers and judges have said, the reasonable limits clause. That's a prepositional phrase in that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
The operative part of that sentence is demonstrably justify. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right? And everything is around it.
So let me just stop you there, just because that's an important point. So what you're saying is there's a disconnection between what the intention of the drafters and the way that test is being construed by governments and also by courts, right?
Totally.
Okay, sorry, please
100%.
continue. I just want to clarify. That's a really important point.
The intent of Section 1 has been completely misinterpreted or misread, totally misread. The intention, this could only be used in a dire state. Now, if you go to Section 4(2), you'll see that that's the way we were thinking, because in fact, Section 4, we had to put in, therefore, the Parliament might have to be extended beyond 5 years, or a legislative assembly, if in fact we're into a dire situation, right? We might be able to have an election to get a new Parliament. We might have to stick with the Parliament we got. Well, how do we do that? Well, we'll extend the life of those parliaments. And what do we say? Only in a war or insurrection. Written right into Section 4(2). Written right. What were we thinking? So I go on to argue, is it plausible to think that me and the rest of the first ministers would have different conditions applying for taking away your freedoms than we would from extending the Parliament? That's very implausible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make sense.
No.
That doesn't stand a rational argument.
It's incongruent, isn't it?
It's incongruent. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. And then the other thing is that the sentence itself is centered around demonstrably justify.
Right.
And then the other part of that is, at the end, it says, within, if you will, or in the context of a free and democratic society. And this is my other, and I think just as powerful argument against what the judges and the lawyers are doing. A free and democratic society in Canada means parliamentary democracy. The people should be involved. So therefore, the parliaments of this nation should have been open. There should have been select committees established that would guide with the government the response to the virus. In other words, the parliamentary committee would be a standing or select committee which would last all the while through the pandemic period, okay? And call in experts, just not government narrative, but call in Peter McCullough, call in Dr. Bridle, call in Dr. Peter Alexander, call in Dr. This one and that one, right?
Right.
And Dr. Roger Hodgson from Alberta.
Jay Bhattacharya, yeah.
From Mr. Dr. Christian from Saskatchewan.
Right.
All of these people who are experts in their field and counterbalance off what the narrative was from the government. And then the select committee would have come to a completely different approach to the pandemic than what happened. That didn't happen, so that test wasn't met. So if even in an argument you wanted to argue that the intent that I'm talking about didn't even apply, which it did, you could argue that the section itself was not met. The test of the section itself was not met in the pandemic. So on either score, the government and the judges are out to lunch.
So here you are. So that gives a great explanation about how you were stirred back into the limelight, sort of dragged back in a Michael Corleone sense. Just when I think I'm out, they pull me back in. And so here you are back in the fray. And just to frame this now, let's talk about this legal action that you brought. And I want you to tell us why. I think I know why you and your lawyer have focused on Section 6,
okay,
the mobility rights, and maybe explain why you chose to frame your constitutional challenge around Section 6, and then explain the Section 1 argument that's connected to it.
Okay. Well, as I got into this more and more and more, and had all of these public meetings, especially in Vancouver Island, because I was allowed to I could travel, right? The communities were close enough. I would have done this, by the way, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, if I was allowed to travel, so I could get back and forth quick and be able to do these things, which is very sad. So it prevented me and it prevented anybody who believes in what I'm saying from having this point of view marketed across Canada in a more forceful way. Besides which, the media shut me down a year and a half ago.
Just on that point, Brian, I just want to comment on one thing. Isn't it strange that in a country, the foundation of which and the existence of which is intimately connected to the completion of a national railway, we cannot get on a train,
right,
right? Unless, so this is, again, this is coming, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to emphasize the fundamental significance of Section 6, the
Yes,
mobility.
I was coming to that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to make that other point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so when I was doing all these public meetings, it became clear to me I was talking to talk. And I said to my wife one morning, and I woke up, I suppose somebody in any day now is going to say to me, okay, Peckford, boy, you're very articulate. You were there, understand, got it. You're talking to talk. How about walking the walk? And I wanted to preempt anybody from thinking that I wasn't so fervently committed to this. I said, I'm going to have to do something more. And the something more was challenge the federal government on that federal mandate. And I chose Section 6. One reason why we chose it, through the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms and Keith Wilson, the lawyer, wonderful people, was that being now so fervently Canadian, having been born not Canadian, and now out there so front and center, how could I best connect with the most people in going to court?
Okay.
And everybody from coast to coast to coast has relatives, family, friends, business. Everybody is affected by the federal travel ban because it's national.
Right. Okay.
I also did it for the reason you just gave. Very cognizant of our history. The railway helped build this country and make it a Canada. Our river systems, our Aboriginal people traveling the river systems, the early explorers traveling the river systems, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes, all speak to travel. We have always been. We became who we are through travel.
We forget about boats. That's a great point. We forget about boats. That's an important mode of travel.
The Mackenzie River. I was so pleased to go to Hay River, on the mouth of the Mackenzie River, right across in Slave Lake, years ago when I was consulting and spend some time, on that river. And Inuvik, when I went up to Inuvik one time, where the river was, we're almost up to the end of it when you get up to the Arctic Ocean. And the other Fraser River, I spent time on the Fraser River, right? When I did an inquiry for the BC government years ago. And the Skeena River, right? The St. Lawrence River, right? And the rivers back, even the rivers back in Newfoundland, the Beothics, the extinct native group of Newfoundland, how did they live? They lived from the river, the Exploits River in central Newfoundland and Gander River in Newfoundland. Okay, so travel is very, so I thought from that point of view, that was very important to connect to as many people as you could. And I've proven me right on that because not a day goes by. I get hundreds and hundreds of emails a day. From the time we've been on here now, I've had quite likely 250, 300. For the days out, another 300 or 400. And like 20 or 30% of them are saying, how's your court case going, Brian? They're so interested in it because they connected with it, you see, right away, because it's travel. And I've had the most tragic stories told to me by people who can't get to see their families in another part of the world or another part of the country, right? Because of this travel ban. So it's connected. Number two, as a good reason as well, is that it went to the Federal Court of Canada, one more step to the Supreme Court of Canada, whereas most of the mandates provincially have to go to the provincial courts first, then to the Supreme Court of Canada, will take long. Mine should be shorter than most of the others. And so for those two reasons, I did it. And also because, I remember well when we went through these freedoms and went through these rights, that was like travel at the time. There were some of these things were debated for a long period of time. Early on, by the way, in the 17 months of negotiations, we were into the charter and a lot of these substantial things. Not at the end. They were at the beginning, a lot of them, except for like the notwithstanding clause and a few of those. And Section 1 was late because I wanted to get in there. And I think it was Lougheed and Bennett and a couple of others wanted to strengthen that justify word, right, which we did. And demonstrably, we wanted to get in there when we were looking for a word, and that was the word we came up with, demonstrably justified, because now we thought we had it. We really had it now. nobody would be able to take away anybody's freedoms until, boy, they really had to go out of their way before they could get close to overriding the rights and freedoms of Canadians. But the other one that was really important for the reasons I just gave about our history, right? Travel became very important. And I remember debates about that. Well, travel is, we don't need to put that in there because it's so self-evident that nobody would ever restrict our travel in Canada, especially a government. But luckily, as we took a more sober look at it, we realized, okay, you got your speech and you got your conscience and your religion, right, and all of that. In Section 2, you got your freedom of assembly and association, right? And, as you go down, and then you say, well, we need some of these rights to be protected as well. And so that's when we got into the travel, across Canada or to leave Canada, and got into life, liberty, and security of the person, right? Which also became very important. And then the copper fastened it off in 15 with equality before the law for everybody, right? So we really thought that this was a pantheon of rights and freedoms that were sacred.
Right.
You can't use the word sacred anymore.
No.
Something wrong, right? It's sacred. You can't use the word sacred anymore.
Or values. People don't talk about values, right?
I think it was Kenny Rogers who said, "Is nothing sacred anymore?" in one of his songs.
Right. Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah.
Is nothing sacred anymore?
Mm-hmm.
That brings me, if you're ready for it.
Let's hear it.
Whereas this country is founded on the principles of the supremacy of God and the rule of law, :
Right. That was deliberate, wasn't it?
That was completely deliberate.
Right.
That was deliberate 10 times over. Yeah. That was deliberate 10 times over.
I think many people don't realize that wording is even in the charter.
And as I say now in my speeches, you think it starts with Section 1. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. And the judge now in the Baudouin case in British Columbia tried to rephrase it.
I read that
in number 2 of his judgment. That's part of my essay.
Yeah.
You nasty man, you have no right to change the wording of what is in the Constitution, sir. Yeah. You may be a judge of the Supreme Court of British Columbia, but you have no license, you have no right to change the wording of that because you changed the meaning of it. You made it completely different from what it was meant. That's why whereas was put in there too. It wasn't just put in there as a statement. It was put in there as leading to, whereas, with a colon. So everything that follows must take into account the supremacy of God and the rule of law. That was the most deliberate thing that was put into that charter.
Yeah, it's a preamble. It's very akin to what a lawyer would put in a court order.
Exactly.
So go ahead, Brian. Didn't mean to cut you
and
off.
so what I'm phrasing my essay as, you will know it first, is God a dirty word? Has God become a dirty word because the supremacy of God is there, as well as the rule of law? And there's a wonderful phraseology in that other book I talked about, Coercing Virtue by Robert Bork, where a number of the jurists around the world talk about, I think the former Supreme Chief Judge of the Israeli court, back several years ago, retired, made a comment about jurisprudence in the law, in which he talked about this very thing, about the rule of law and how he related it to permanent values.
Right.
And other early founders of the United States Constitution and later jurists have already picked up that phraseology and that the rule. What does the rule of law mean to you? What kind of thing. And then you have to respond and articulate what your meaning of it is.
Right.
And a number of these very seasoned, decades on the bench jurists are saying, this is what it means to me. This is what it means about having a nation. It's really funny now with what's happening globally. And I began this other little personal crusade in my own set of ideas, is that I'm a strong proponent of the nation state. in the face of the globalization that's trying to take over everything. And it's really funny now, right, how important a nation state is going to become because of this globalization. How important these words that are now in our Constitution Act of 1982 that weren't even in there earlier, how important they are now to guide us into a very uncertain future, which has pressures which are trying to destabilize the nation state.
Well, I'm quite looking forward to reading your essay. I enjoyed the last one that you wrote that was published on your blog and also in the Frontier Center for Public Policy.
Yeah.
You were kind enough to send me a note about one that I had written about our enemy of the state, which talks about how Canadians are in this shocking position because we had been so well governed by people like yourselves, the other giants that you named. We're a bit spoiled, and actually Conrad Block talks about this in his book, which is my reading recommendation, the Canadian Manifesto. Canadians are a bit spoiled because we have been really, really well governed for a long time, and we really don't know how to react to being really under attack by our governments. And more than that, I talked about orcophilia. There's also he talks about in that book the concept of oikophobia, which is a strange phenomenon. Dr. Godsad talks about parasitic ideas in his book, The Parasitic Mind, if you've read that.
Right.
And this is one where we're actually being taught to hate our country, to disregard its traditions, to be fearful of them, and to see our values, our cherished values, as restrictive. And therefore, they have to be destroyed and broken down in the name of freedom. But actually, when you think about it, it's a form of nihilism. It's taking freedom to a degree, a valueless freedom, which results in nihilism and unhappiness. And then we see this happening in our country today, where we're so divided, we're so unhappy, we're bickering with each other. You know, spend 5 minutes on Facebook, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about.
Exactly. Right? I'm taking down the Sir John A. Macdonald, the statue down in the city of Victoria, for example. You know, I mean, absolutely unbelievable what happened.
There's no country without him. You know,
and when you were talking about leadership and our institution a few minutes ago, and you know, defending things and how our process, I did a presentation to a group of MLAs in Alberta who wanted me to give them a presentation of how I viewed the Constitution and viewed what's happening now, which I did. And one MLA spoke up afterwards, and this was, my wife had just left to go out. I'm on here so long.
I mean, we've kept you a long time. I'm going to let you go soon here.
Yeah, but, exactly. And he said to me, well, what can we do? I said, have you ever thought to bringing some stuff to your caucus? I said, have you ever initiated anything out of your caucus? Well, he says, our caucuses don't meet that often. Well, I said, you should force that meet. I said, in my caucus, in my day, before a piece of legislation was introduced, it went to the caucus. Oh, no, he said, that doesn't happen anymore. And so every MLA across the nation, right, it's quite likely, the caucus only meets when the prime minister or premier wants to make sure he's got everybody on side for something that he's doing in the House, right? You know, and for gradual and normal party things. But the caucus can be, and was in my day, the caucus was a part of the whole apparatus. And therefore, any bill of any consequence, the minister had to introduce it to caucus first, get the feedback from caucus, perhaps might make the bill better, right? Do we have support for this amongst our own caucus? And many times there are members who abstained from some of our government bills, and that was fine. That was fine. Then you could define what is confidence and what is not, so that you still had a government or whatever, but you could involve the caucus and parliamentary committees in a lot more of proper lawmaking than is happening today. Nope, without changing a thing. Could be done tomorrow. If all governments across the country started to believe in a more parliamentary form of government, that could be done.
I was telling you about that interview I heard of Mr. Manning, Preston Manning, and just as a corollary to the point you just made, he was saying one of the things that used to exist in his time, and he was talking about, for example, the formation of his party, the Reform Party,
Yeah.
just some people getting together with ideas. But he's saying that part of the reason, it's a chicken and egg thing, part of the reason why we're not getting the kind of leaders that we want is because people are not getting involved at the grassroots level of politics the way you did and the way
Yes.
he did. And that's something that fundamentally, looking forward, if we were going to forecast some solutions or fashion some solutions to what's going on in Canada, that would be a big one, right?
You need some new political parties. You need political parties where their structure is completely different.
That's exactly what he said.
And their whole concept of governance is different.
Yeah. So Max Bernier is on the right track.
When they try to reinvent the Conservative Party from within, what they're doing is not going to work.
Yeah.
It's not going to work because you got same old players there who believe in a governance system which is completely the opposite of the antithesis of what good parliamentary democracy is supposed to be all about.
Right. Well, Brian, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. We've gotten so much from here. The goal of this podcast is to have a deep and meaningful conversation and really get people on like you who can share ideas in a way that, number one, assumes that the listener is intelligent, and also that they are therefore interested in having this kind of a conversation. And you've given us splashes of history and philosophy and economics and law. Wonderful. So, okay, here's our reading list. Brian Peckford, tell us about the book.
It's no longer available in hardcover, but you can pick it up on Amazon on Kindle.
Okay, Brian.
Who's okay? It's still there.
Great.
So you can get it. And in there goes through a lot of the constitutional stuff, plus a lot of the history that we talked about. And
so
even
what's the full title, Brian? I see Brian.
The full title is a saying that a lot of older Newfoundlanders remember well. Someday the sun will shine and have not will be no more.
Oh, beautiful.
And that's my signature, okay? So people can go on Kindle and get that if they want to know more about the Constitution and about me. I do recommend The Coercing Virtue by Robert Bork. And it talks about not just the U.S., talks about the Canadian situation as it relates to how the courts are becoming too powerful and are taking over the role that an elected person is supposed to have. There's a big, there are the three branches of government, right? The Parliament, the executive, and the judiciary. And the judiciary is now moving outside its normal limits of power.
Right.
To put it that way. And then the one I mentioned earlier, which was Democracy in Canada, the Disintegration of Our Institutions by Donald J. Savoie, who is a scholar and a professor at the University of Moncton in New Brunswick, and who has been involved in talking about political governance for decades. And this is really his epic. This is the crowning glory of the work that he's done on talking about it. And it's very relevant and very current. It's only 2 years old. And so it even deals with the $600 million that the federal government gave to the press, is even in here.
If you will grace us with our presence again, I want to talk about that during our next visit.
Okay.
But thank you so much for those reading reading materials, and also we would be remiss if we didn't mention your blog.
Right.
So where we find your blog? We just
find the blog at Peckford, a 4 and a 2, number 4, number 2, Peckford, a number 4, number 2, .wordpress.com. And I would encourage people who are really interested in political, philosophy, Montesquieu and Mill. I love Montesquieu and Mill. John Stuart Mill and Count Montesquieu are two wonderful, and I have their books here. I have all their works right here on this library. All of Mill's works are here. All of Montesquieu's works are all here. I got all Greek history here and Roman history here. Cicero, if you want to look at a hero, look at a Cicero who tried. He didn't succeed, and he sort of succumbed to the establishment at the end, but he did fight very hard to have the Senate of Rome have more power, and that the autocrats and the totalitarian people have less. All of the emperors of the time, including Caesar and Augustus and all of those. But if you want to go back into Greek history, you got to read about Solon and you got to read about Pericles. and you got to read about Socrates.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Brian. We're so grateful to have had you, and you've shared so generous with your knowledge and your history. Speaking personally, I've learned so much today, and I know all of our listeners, everyone consuming this podcast, has had a much better opportunity. I had seen you appear on other podcasts, and a big reason why I wanted to have you on my program is because I always had the sense that the other people, no offense to people like Jordan Peterson, who's off the charts brilliant, I admire him, but I felt that we just were kind of skimming the surface of what we could get into with you in a deeper conversation. And that's the niche of this podcast. That's what we're trying to achieve. And I really think you've helped us get there today. So thank you so much for giving us so much of your time.
Thank you very
It's
much.
been a wonderful talk. And of course, if people want to find out what's going on with your lawsuit, are there updates posted on your blog?
I will now start doing that. Yeah, and it's all registered, and it's now going through the process, as you would know well than most Canadians, of everybody submitting their documents and all that. And so it's well underway, and we anticipate, perhaps we might be a little bit optimistic, having it heard in September.
Wow. Well, we'll look forward to that. And one last request, would you consider running for prime minister?
I'm asked that a bit, but that 80th birthday is coming up in August. And,
well, whatever you're doing to keep your mind sharp, I wish you'd send an email to Mr. Biden.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's been our pleasure. Thank you so much, and also thank your wife for making you available to us.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day, and keep reading Shakespeare and Voltaire, please.
All right, I'm going to read some of the books you referred me to, including yours. Thank you.